Democratic Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who went to Yale University, who was a judge, who has served in Congress since 1995 for the great state of Texas, well, she took time out from her busy schedule to educate us all on space. Here's another case of a lefty losing it galactically.
A full moon is that complete rounded circle, which is made up mostly of gases. And that's why the question is why or how could we as humans live on the moon? Are the gases such that we could do that? The sun is a mighty powerful heat that is almost impossible to go near the sun. The moon is more manageable.
The moon is made up of gases. Maybe we can live there, but the sun is near impossible for us to get to. Nearly impossible. So, maybe we can get there. Joining me now is the senior editor-at-large of Newsweek, Josh Hammer. Josh, where do I start here? The Democrats claim to be the party of science, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Most of them don't know what a woman is, and here is a veteran congresswoman who seems to know less about space than your average grade 1 student.
Rita, I saw this story earlier, and I quite literally burst out laughing. Our politics in America are so cynical and jaded these days, and there's so much terrible stuff out there. The headlines are so much more horrific than the next, that every so often a little levity is needed. And I guess I'm actually somewhat grateful for Sheila Jackson Lee for providing a little bit of levity amidst a lot of depressing news. Funny enough, I actually used to live in Sheila Jackson Lee's congressional district. So I live in Florida now, but I lived in Texas for 4 years. And about a year and a half of those 4 years was spent in Houston, which is where Sheila Jackson Lee is the congresswoman. Now, to make this even worse, and it's pretty bad at face value, but to make it even worse than it already is, Houston, Texas, as you probably know, Rita, is the home of NASA. NASA is located just outside in Houston, in the suburbs. That is where the entire U.S. space industry is based. That's where you hear the people in the Apollo movie saying, Houston, we have a problem. They're talking to Houston. They're talking to Sheila Jackson Lee. And she thinks that the rock is made up of gas. God help us, honestly.
Well, she almost became the mayor of Houston recently, so they dodged a bullet there perhaps, but she's still representing the state in other ways. Now, talking about Florida, a Florida mother has been sentenced to a month in prison and 3 months of home confinement for stealing and selling the diary of President Joe Biden's daughter, Ashley, to Project Veritas. Josh, incredible that with the media seems more interested in how Project Veritas got the diary than they are with the contents of this diary, which, as far as I know, have not been denied. In this diary, Ashley explores why she was, and I quote, hypersexualized at a young age, referencing being sexualized, having sex with friends at a young age. And most concerning of all, she wrote about showers with my dad, probably not appropriate. What can you tell us about this diary and the case that's just been finalised in Manhattan?
Yeah, I can't imagine why the mainstream media would try to avoid a juicy diary where you have a member of the Biden family talking about showering with the big guy himself, Joe Biden. Look, Joe Biden's been around the block. He's been a fixture of U.S. politics for roughly a half century or so. There have been so many times over the years where you see him awkwardly hugging, very awkwardly patting young girls on the head, sniffing them. I hesitate to use the word perverted, but frankly, it's hard to avoid it when you look at a lot of the clips over the years as to how this man acts when he is around women who happen to be a lot younger than he is. Apparently, it includes those who share his last name, Biden, as well. Project Veritas, which unfortunately is a shell of what it once was, the organization and James O'Keefe had a bit of a falling out, but they did tremendous work when they were in operation. James O'Keefe himself was actually pinned to the floor of his own house by the FBI back in 2021, 2022 for various other exploits, very much including the Ashley Biden journal diary saga there. So they have paid a significant price there. Ultimately, it amounts to a war on the First Amendment, a war on journalistic freedom here, and just another example, as if we needed another example of the state wielding power to punish its enemies in a deeply ideological way.
And can you imagine if this was Ivanka's diary and she had written this about Donald Trump? It would be the biggest story in the world. Everyone would be across that story. And there would be so many Americans who aren't even across this, despite the existence of this diary and Project Veritas publishing parts of it. Now, let's talk about trust in the National Public Radio broadcaster. That's plummeted. Our own ABC should take note of this next story. One of the stalwarts there, Yuri Berliner, who's worked at NPR for 25 years, wrote a scathing piece for the Free Press outlining how the network has lost its way and lost the trust of its audience. He writes, concerned by the lack of viewpoint diversity, I looked at voter registration for our newsroom in DC, where NPR is headquartered and many of us live. I found 87 registered Democrats working in editorial positions and 0 Republicans, none. And Josh, I've got to say, it shows, and as a taxpayer-funded media outlet, it has an obligation to be neutral, and it certainly is not, just like our ABC and SBS here in Australia.
Right. So it's the taxpayer-funded nature of NPR that has always been problematic, and this has always been the reason that many Republican politicians have sought to defund it. Hopefully this article that Yuri Berliner, to his great credit, went ahead and did publicly under his own name. By the way, an aside, Rita, it'll be very interesting to see how long he lasts. I mean, will he be actually out of a job next week at NPR after this whole tell-all story that he published at Barry Weiss's Free Press? That's a very interesting story in and of itself there. But, one data point that I saw in his article today that I thought was fascinating is that he goes back to as recently as 2012, which was the presidential election cycle where Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama. In 2012, the NPR readership was only about 11% more Democrat than Republican. Then you fast forward it to the present day, it's like 55 to 60% more Democrat than Republican. So, what is going on there when it comes to the readership and the listenership? It's happened over a very short, compressed time. And I think the obvious answer, Rita, which we see playing across all of American media for the most part, other than a few stalwarts, for the most part, it's just Trump derangement syndrome. It is a post-2016, post-Trump phenomenon. NPR has been the tip of that spear, unfortunately.
It has, and it's ironic that this station that prides itself on diversity and tracks the potential job candidates there, their race, their gender, identity, all sorts of diversity and equity inclusion staff have been pushed up the ranks. And yet you look at its audience and it's overwhelmingly white, affluent, urban. They really do not actually serve the diversity of America. Only 6% of their audience is black. And when you look at the population, 14% is black. Similar with the Hispanic population, only 7% of their audience is Hispanic, when Hispanics make up around 19% of the population. So there's some really interesting takeouts there. And NPR's response has been to basically bury its head in the sand. In a letter to staff, the acting chief content officer said, I and my colleagues on the leadership team strongly disagree with Yuri's assessment of the quality of our journalism and the integrity of our newsroom processes. Yeah, okay. Whatever. Let's talk about housing affordability. This is an issue that's big in the US. It's big right here in Australia, but it's an issue that's really worsened under the Biden administration. This is something Turning Point USA's Charlie Kirk explained recently.
I'm looking right now towards my future, and I'm really having a hard time really seeing myself being able to do the same things like my parents have done, such as buy a house at a young age and whatnot. Do you think there's going to be any change in the housing market?
It's a great question. So 4 years ago, the average income to be able to buy a home in this country was $59,000 a year. Now it requires $106,000 a year to buy a home. You have been robbed by the DC political class, and then big corporations like BlackRock come in and purchase these homes and then rent them back to you.
Josh, how much of an issue is this in the lead up to the presidential election? I know you've got some massive issues there, illegal immigration, the entire cost of living inflation, the crime, but surely young people being priced out of the housing market has so many long-term consequences.
Yeah, I mean, this is a massive issue, Rita, and I was happy to see that Turning Point USA was covering it. And Charlie, by the way, in his answer there is exactly right to point a big finger at BlackRock and other major institutional investors. You know, BlackRock and other like-minded financial institutions are buying up tons and tons of residential property across America. In fact, there's actually a very interesting recent law that passed in Texas, my former state there. It was signed into law by Governor Greg Abbott that would actually limit the amount of purely residential property that large institutional investors and buyers like BlackRock can buy. And, you know, some people might look at that and say, oh, you're impinging upon free market. They can do whatever they want. But you know, there's something to be said for good old-fashioned common sense, frankly. And in a time like this, where Gen Z and millennials are struggling more than their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation to get that first home, I'm a millennial. I'm only 35 years old. I mean, I know that acute pain very much firsthand there. It's really tough out there, and it's doubly tough given the fact that the Federal Reserve is talking about potentially actually kicking interest rates even higher as inflation continues to still be stubborn. It's very, very unfortunate right now, but I think the housing market, Rita, is one of the #1 issues, probably why Biden is actually hemorrhaging support among millennials and Gen Z. He's currently polling within a 10-point margin when it comes to the 18 and 35 demographic. From a Democratic Party standpoint, that's not going to cut it. He needs that number way up.
Oh, absolutely. The numbers there in successive polls would be very disturbing to the Democrats indeed. Josh Hammer, thank you so much for your time this evening.